Good afternoon. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the director of the Dickey Center, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this year's Rabbi Marshall Meyer Great Issues Lecture on Social Justice, which will be delivered by Thomas Buergenthal and is entitled Scenes from a Life from the Auschwitz Death March to the International Court of Justice. Before I say more about our speaker, let me just say something about this event. The annual Marshall Meyer Lecture is both one of the high points of the calendar for the Dickey Center and also one of my very favorite events. And I want to begin by thanking Andy Lewin of the class of '81. Andy couldn't be here, but he was thrilled at who we were having speaking this year. And I want to thank him again for his family's generosity in endowing this lecture. I also want to thank the Tucker Center for co-sponsoring this event. And I'm delighted that Rabbi Davin Litwin is here with us today. It is always gratifying to recount the great achievements of those we have a connection with. And one of the things that I like most about this event is being able to recount the story of Marshall Meyer, whose achievements were truly inspiring. Dartmouth, as I've noted the last 4 times that I got to preside over this event, is renowned for many things, but not necessarily the number of rabbis it has produced. The college, however, can be proud that in Marshall Meyer of the class of '52, it educated one of the great ones of the last century. Much influenced by Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great rabbi, teacher, and human rights advocate, friend of Martin Luther King, and father of our own Susanna Heschel, who I hope is here or will be shortly. After having encountering Abraham Joshua Heschel, Marshall Meyer, who came from a rather assimilated family, enrolled in the Jewish Theological Seminary, and after receiving his ordination, accepted a pulpit in Buenos Aires. He remained in the Argentinian capital and played a really heroic role there during the Dirty War that was waged by the military junta from 1976 to 1983. He was an unrelenting critic of the junta, an unyielding advocate of human rights, and he is personally credited with saving the lives of hundreds of those who were persecuted by the regime. He routinely visited political prisoners, demonstrated that they were not forgotten, and he pursued the cases of many of those who the regime disappeared. And he worked for the release of the renowned journalist Jacobo Timmerman, who later dedicated his classic work, Prisoner Without a Name, Cell Without a Number, to Rabbi Meyer. In 1983, when democracy was restored, the country's president, Raul Alfonsin, awarded Marshall Meyer the nation's highest decoration, the Order of the Liberator. Marshall Meyer later returned to the United States, took a pulpit on the Upper West Side of New York, where it's my hope we all wind up at some point, and became an influential voice for human rights and social justice in the conservative movement of Judaism. He died young, I'm sorry to say, in 1993, but I am glad to say that our speaker today actually knew Marshall Meyer and can tell us more about him. Born in Czechoslovakia in 1934, Tom Buergenthal had a youth that can only be described as extraordinary. With the rise of Hitler, he and his family fled Czechoslovakia for Poland in 1939 and were set to leave for England on September 1, 1939, a fateful day when the Nazis invaded Poland. The train he was on that day was strafed, and he and his parents had to turn in a different direction to the ghetto in the Polish town of Kielce, where they would live for almost 4 years. In 1942, most of the ghetto was liquidated, and almost the entire Jewish community, more than 20,000 people, were deported to Treblinka and killed upon arrival. Tom and his parents were among the very few who were kept in Kielce in a labor camp. And when in 1943 that camp was liquidated, he narrowly missed being killed along with the other remaining children. After a stay in another forced labor camp, the Buergenthals were deported to Auschwitz in August of 1944, where he was eventually separated from his father, who did not survive the war. He again narrowly missed being caught up in the selections that were so infamous at the time and that kept the crematoria running. In January of 1945, he was evacuated from the camp in the Auschwitz Death March, which brought him to the concentration camp Sachsenhausen, where he was eventually liberated by Russian forces. There is so much more to tell here that I can only plead with you to read Tom's memoir, A Lucky Child, which came out in 2009. It's been published in more than a dozen languages and been a bestseller in many different countries. It has fast become a true classic of Holocaust literature. Reunited with his mother in 1946, Tom Buergenthal came to the United States in 1951. He attended Bethany College in West Virginia and later New York Law School, and eventually gained 2 more advanced degrees in law at Harvard. He's taught at a number of different law schools, was dean of the Washington College of Law at American University, and has written or co-written more than a dozen books on international law and human rights. And in the course of that, become one of the people who has really created human rights as a subdiscipline within the law. Along the way, he did a tremendous amount of work, practical work in the field of human rights, including spending 12 years as one of the founding judges and eventually president of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. He served on the UN Truth Commission for El Salvador, the UN Human Rights Committee, and the Claims Resolution Tribunal for Dormant Accounts in Switzerland. From 2000 to 2010, he served as the American judge on the International Court of Justice, otherwise known as the World Court. He has been awarded a dozen honorary doctorates and numerous distinguished prizes. In his memoir, Tom talks about living in Germany after the war and, as a high school student, fantasizing about having a machine gun that he could fire from his balcony in revenge for the murder of his grandfather and grandparents. And in a passage that in a real sense sums up his post-war life, he wrote, "It took me a long time to get over these sentiments and to recognize that such indiscriminate acts of vengeance would not bring my father or grandparents back to life. It took me much longer to realize that one cannot hope to protect mankind from crimes such as those that were visited upon us unless one struggles to break the cycle of hatred and violence that invariably leads to ever more suffering by innocent human beings." I hope you'll welcome Tom Buergenthal to Dartmouth.
Good afternoon. If you were thinking that I was going to speak without a speech, you're mistaken. I left it here beforehand. Thank you very much, Dan, for this lovely introduction. Let me also tell you that, as Dan mentioned already, I knew Rabbi Marshall Meyer. I met my wife and I met him in Argentina shortly after the military regime fell. I was then a judge on the Inter-American Court, and the court decided, when the military regime fell, to go to Argentina in a symbolic gesture to show its appreciation that a democratic government came to power again in Argentina. So it's a great honor for me to lecture, and a lecture that is named after Marshall Meyer, who really was an unbelievably courageous man who saved many, many lives, particularly many students, from that terrible dictatorship. I thought I would start by telling you a little bit something about the death march out of Auschwitz. Actually, I should tell you that most children who arrived on the ramp in Auschwitz, at the railroad's arrival ramp, never made it to the camp. And there usually was a selection. Children and old people, sick people were separated and immediately sent to the gas chamber. When our transport came, we didn't have a selection. Only my mother was taken to the women's camps, and I with my father to the men's camp. Of course, once inside the camp, there were other selections, and the usual thing, the beatings, the hunger, everything else. But I won't deal with that. Instead, I'll start with the discussion of what it was like to be on the famous Auschwitz death march, and then I will continue with other more exciting and interesting and happy topics. In January 1945, Soviet troops came closer and closer to Auschwitz. And at that point, the SS decided to evacuate the camp and move us to Germany because they needed laborers, free labor, of course. We were driven out of our barracks and lined up a few thousand of inmates out of Auschwitz with heavy SS guards on either side. Then we had to walk for 3 days to a town called Gleiwitz in German and Gliwice in Polish. From there, after a day of rest, we were loaded onto an open freight railroad cars and taken on a 9-day trip to Germany. Keep in mind that all this took place in January in Polish winters with temperatures never higher than 0. And with all of us dressed in thin camp uniforms. Before we started on our march out of Auschwitz, we were given a small loaf of bread and a can of something which I could not open and which I threw away during the first day because it was simply too heavy for me to carry. We walked for 3 days with only about an hour a day rest. And if you stopped walking and sat down, you were immediately shot. An SS guard would then kick the body into the nearby ditch along the roads. The roads were covered with snow and ice. Most of us wore torn shoes and with paper rags for socks. As we continued walking, particularly during the second and third day, more and more people sat down. They were immediately shot. After a while, the shots no longer bothered me. I've gotten used to it. I was walking with 2 friends. They were about 13 or 14 years old. They arrived in Auschwitz on the same transport as we arrived from Kielce. We soon figured out that in order to rest, we would run to the front of the long column of prisoners and try to stand. And then when we reached the end of the column, we would then just run back and forth, rest, run back and forth. And we managed to do that for the next 3 days. Of course, we were pushed and kicked by the marchers along the way, but that was a small price to pay for being able to rest and stand. We were hungry and tired, and there were many moments when I was tempted to sit down and get it over with. But having decided that I was fighting Hitler in my own war, and remember I was 10 years old at the time, I decided that if I sat down, he would win, and I wasn't going to allow him to do that. Once we arrived in Gliwice, we could rest for a day or 2 and received some bread and a watery soup on arrival. The next day, we were lined up again and marched to the railroad station. There, we were loaded into open railroad cars, I should say stuffed into railroad cars, because there was no room to sit on the first day because the cars were simply too full. Every day thereafter, for the next 8 or 9 days, there was more and more room, and more people died of hunger, the cold, and exhaustion. When we asked the guard what to do with the bodies, our S-guard said, "Throw them overboard." And that was done. For the rest of the trip, by the time we arrived in Sachsenhausen, which was the concentration camp from which I was liberated, we had enough room to walk from one end of the car to another. So many of us had died. Before getting on the train, we received what looked to me like 2 slices of bread. And that was to be our ration for the rest of the trip. Of course, by the second or third day, the hunger and the cold were getting more and more unbearable. Then about halfway on our trip, a miracle happened. As the train moved through Czechoslovakia, and it was then Czechoslovakia, by that time, to get to Germany, the Germans could no longer take a direct route to Germany. They had to go through Czechoslovakia. People began to wave from bridges in Czechoslovakia, under which we had to pass, and then loaves of bread began to rain down on us. My two friends and I were able to catch 3 loaves, which they gave to me to hold. Even though 1 loaf was stolen from me, we had enough bread to get to Sachsenhausen. Once in Sachsenhausen, our destination, my feet were hurting more and more. By then, my toes had turned dirty blue and eventually black. At that point, I decided that I could no longer avoid going to the infirmary. And I should tell you that in Auschwitz, if you ended up in the infirmary, you would never get up because every few weeks there would be a selection. So I didn't want to go to the infirmary, but I had no choice. So I went just to ask for some cream or whatever would help me. As soon as I got in, a nurse saw my toes, told me to lie down on a nearby table so that the doctor could look at my toes. Then 2 men came into the room, studied my toes for a minute, and before I knew what was happening, grabbed me on each side of the table. I began to scream, and as soon as they put a cloth on my face and poured some fluid over it. Within a few minutes, I was asleep. And when I woke up, I was told that the doctors had been able to save all toes on my left foot, but had to amputate 2 on the right and disable the remaining 3. I was still in the infirmary, recovering from these procedures when the camp was liberated by Soviet and Polish troops. Liberation was wonderful, of course, except that I was alone and had nowhere to go because my father had been separated from me earlier, and my mother was moved to another camp. I did not know whether my parents were alive, although it never occurred to me, and that's interesting for a child, it never occurred to me that my parents wouldn't be alive. Despite all of what I had seen in the camp, that didn't apply to my parents. They had to be alive. Some days after my liberation, I met a group of Polish soldiers. When they heard me speak Polish, they decided to adopt me as a mascot of their division. Thus began an exciting period in my life. The company tailor made me a uniform, and the shoemaker fixed my shoes. They gave me a small Italian pistol, and a few days later liberated a circus pony for me. Because the Polish soldiers, many of them were still riding horses. With my pony and my pony, I could follow them and not get behind. And since Berlin had yet not been liberated, my troops was ordered to proceed to Berlin to work with the Soviet troops. And they took me along, of course, and then I always felt free to say that I helped liberate Berlin. Once Germany had surrendered, all Polish soldiers were ordered to return to Poland. They took me along, of course, and that is how I left Germany and arrived in Poland. A few weeks later, I ended up in a Jewish orphanage in Poland. In the meantime, my mother, who was liberated from the Ravensbrück concentration camp in April of 1945, began to search for me. We were reunited more than 2 years after we had been separated in Auschwitz. Years later, I learned that my father had died in Buchenwald. We had initially been told that he died in Flossenburg. And as a matter of fact, the first edition of my book speaks about Flossenburg. People were just throwing these names around. But it was Buchenwald where he died. My life began for me after I arrived in the United States, as you heard, in 1951. Legally, I should say, which is something that's very important today for an immigrant. Who would have guessed that 50 years later, in January of 2000, I would be nominated by the United States to the International Court of Justice, and in due course elected by the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council to be a judge on that court. I served on the ICJ, the world's highest court, for 10 years. I could have remained another 5 because I had been re-elected, but my wife decided that the time had come to get reacquainted with our children and grandchildren, so we returned to the United States. It would probably not surprise you that, given my background, that I would from time to time reflect on the role international law and the international community might have played when Hitler started the Holocaust. One often wonders, how could it have happened? Why did nobody speak up? Why didn't the countries say anything? Well, let me give you a little lesson in international law. Unfortunately, before World War II, international human rights law was not a concept international law recognized. This meant that the way a state treated its nationals was a matter exclusively within the domestic jurisdiction of that state. One important consequence of this pre-World War II law was that if the United States, for example, had called on Germany to stop mistreating German Jews during the Hitler period, Germany would have been able to claim that this was an act of illegal intervention in Germany's domestic affairs. That was the state of international law at the time. This rule gave states who might have wanted to intervene, and the majority a marvelous excuse not to intervene at all and remain silent. Did this legal situation change once Germany had invaded other European countries and began to murder their Jewish and non-Jewish inhabitants? When the war was over, these states had valid and enforceable claims under international law against Germany for the harm caused their Jewish and non-Jewish nationals. But the victims themselves had no such rights against Germany under the international law that existed at the time. This was due to another pre-World War II international law rule that only states were subject of international law and thus had rights under that law, whereas individuals were objects under international law and had no rights under international law whatsoever. The end of World War II led to the adoption of the United Nations Charter, as you know, in 1945. It required the United Nations in Article 55 to promote universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. And in Article 56 of the Charter, all UN member states pledged themselves to take joint and separate action in cooperation with the organization for the achievement of the purpose set forth in Article 55. 3 years later, in 1948, the UN adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which defines the meaning of these rights. There followed the UN Covenants on Human Rights, one proclaiming civil and political rights, and the other economic, social, and cultural rights. The covenants, together with the Universal Declaration, comprise the UN's International Bill of Rights. Thus, international human rights law was born. It establishes the fundamental principles that human beings, qua human beings, have certain basic human rights under international law, and to that extent are subject of that law. Additional international and regional human rights treaties deal with racial discrimination, the right of children, the rights of women, slavery, genocide, and many other similar rights. Does this mean that international human rights is now fully affected? Of course not. There are many reasons why we still have a long way to go to make international human rights law fully effective. At the same time, though, international human rights is being complied with in various countries. It is being enforced in regional tribunals in Europe, in the Americas, and to some extent in Africa. Today, moreover, human rights are no longer matters within the exclusive domestic jurisdiction of states. They are matters of international concern. As a result, states are now free to condemn violations of human rights wherever committed and to take appropriate international and regional measures to stop such violations. In other words, they have no more excuses as they had before the war. These steps are by no means always effective, but they are certainly better than the lack of any remedies in the past, which left human rights violators free to engage in serious violations without fear of any international reaction. The most encouraging developments as far as international human rights is concerned are due to the establishment of regional human rights tribunals in Europe, the Americas, and in Africa. These courts were set up to enforce the human rights, these three treaties, the European Convention on Human Rights, the African Convention on Human Rights, and the African Charter on Human and People's Rights proclaim. All these treaties guarantee basic civil and political rights. The African Charter also protects various economic and social rights. The regional courts have jurisdiction to deal with interstate disputes and claims by individual states. Although the Inter-American courts and the African court may only hear individual petitions after they have been submitted to an intermediate commission, the European Commission of Human Rights allows private individuals to file claims directly against a state in their court. Unfortunately, there are still important regions of the world that have no regional courts, and especially the largest one, Asia, has no court whatsoever. The UN has not established a human rights court. It has, however, created the International Criminal Court and a number of ad hoc criminal tribunals that have jurisdiction to try individuals for serious violations of human rights that amount to international criminal offenses, including genocide and crimes against humanity. The best known of these tribunals is the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. It was established in 1993 and concluded its work this year. In the process, it not only convicted many individuals, it also established a vast body of international criminal law. The UN human rights treaties provide also for some so-called treaty bodies that also have some judicial powers, but unfortunately, the decisions of these treaty bodies are not legally binding, although we find more and more states are complying with it. So much a lesson in international law, and most of it is not very promising, but we're making progress. And I should tell you that somebody who's experienced what I have experienced cannot really afford to be cynical about it. We have to fight, and we've seen a lot of progress. Let me therefore share some progress with you that I think is particularly were surprising at once and tremendously impressive. And in other words, let me share my experience a few weeks ago in Germany. After leaving Germany for the US in 1951, after I found my mother found me in Poland and then brought me to Germany, I have been returning to Germany every few years, first to visit my mother and then for a variety of professional reasons. My latest trip took me to Germany, this one with my wife and 2 of our children and 2 of our grandchildren. And the reason for the trip was very personal and special. The installation of 2 so-called Stolpersteine, or tripping stones, actually metal plaques implanted in the sidewalk in front of my grandparents' home, former house. The house is still standing on a major street in Göttingen, a university town where my mother and my uncle were born and my grandparents lived. And my mother, of course, and brother were born in that house. My grandparents were deported from this house in 1942 to the Warsaw Ghetto and then the Kielce Ghetto and died in Treblinka, which was by far the worst extermination camp during the Holocaust. The Stolpersteine, or plaques in front of their house, were designed to commemorate my grandparents' memory. Similar Stolpersteine events have been taking place in many German cities in the past few years. At our ceremony, after the plaque had been installed, 2 representatives of the Göttingen City Council recalled the lives of my grandparents and their death in Treblinka. I was also invited to speak. About 75 to 100 bystanders, men, women, and high school students, watched the ceremony from the street, which was totally blocked off. Our ceremony took place in Göttingen on the same day. Other ceremonies, like the one for my grandparents, took place in Göttingen on the same day. In a number of places, also Jewish families had been murdered in Treblinka. A day earlier, the principal of the high school I had attended for 2 years before coming to the United States invited me to come to the school to meet with the senior class of the school. After the principal introduced me to the class and I answered some questions from the students, one student was called to the podium. She began by saying that she and a small group of students from her German class and their teacher recently returned from a visit to Auschwitz. They were so moved and appalled by what they had seen on their trip. They decided to write me a letter, which she proceeded to read. In the letter, the students told me that after seeing Auschwitz and learning what had happened there, they wanted to apologize for the crimes their generation of German grandparents committed against my family and all other victims of the Holocaust. And they were angry that their parents never told them about Auschwitz or any other camp. This brief summary does not really do justice to the student's letter. To do that, I would have to translate 10 handwritten pages in which they struggled honestly to come to grips with the German past, and they had read about it only very little. Let me note in this connection that a large number of German schools have over the years participated in similar visits, either to Auschwitz, to Buergenthal, or to Sachsenhausen, as well as other camps. The German federal government and state governments are now also beginning to require immigrants to visit these camps in order to counteract anti-Semitism that some recent immigrant groups have allegedly been bringing to Germany, particularly from the Middle East. These are 2 of many stories I could cite that exemplify the transformation of Germany that I have witnessed. A transformation from a killer nation to one of the most democratic countries of contemporary Europe. This transformation has been achieved over a 70-year period of education, constitutional democracy, and protection of human rights, initially with the help of the UK, the US, and France, and for the past 50 years or more by Germany's political, social, economic, and educational institutions. Germany's successful economy has also had an important impact on the development of today's Germany, as well as its membership in the European Union, the Council of Europe, and NATO. To me, this story of Germany's transformation demonstrates what education should do in combating racial and religious tolerance and hatred. That is also why I believe that the emergence of a right-wing German political party with strong anti-immigrant policies and anti-democratic tendencies that recently entered the German parliament will not be able to derail the truly democratic nation that Germany has become. As one who has worked in the human rights fields almost my entire life, today's Germany gives me hope that nations can change for the better, and that I have not wasted all of my time in this field. Thank you. It helps. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, we need to turn this on now?
You're on.
Oh.
Yeah. You were on before, but you're on better now. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I feel like several of my questions dissolved in midair during your speech, and I kept hearing myself say, well, if Tom Buergenthal can be optimistic, why can't I? But for those of us who haven't gone through what you have, it seems like it's a particularly grim moment for human rights when we look at Syria, when we look at Burma, when we look at the fact that our own advocacy of human rights, that is to say the United States in the international community, has temporarily ended. How do we have confidence and optimism against that backdrop right now?
Well, what else can we do?
Well, I agree, and in some ways we're all Hegelians now. We're all swinging from one extreme to another, and hoping that the next go around will be even stronger.
Yes, for one thing, I think we cannot give up because Germany proved that it's possible, and Germany is not the only country where anti-Semitism is not as strong as it used to be. And who would have thought that the Germany I described could be the Germany of today? And I must say, I never believed it. When I was in the high school that I mentioned, I was the only Jewish student there, and the students would come over to me and look at me and say, "Are you really Jewish? You don't have that big nose and these big teeth." This was sort of the thing, and it's a very different Germany today when you go there and see that. I only wish I knew how it was accomplished, but it can be accomplished in other places as well. It just takes time, patience, and especially a commitment by the United States, which unfortunately, as you point out, at this point is not what it used to be.
I don't know if you heard, but apparently the president said yesterday or today that trafficking in human beings has never been so bad in all of human history. So historical consciousness is clearly a big part of the equation. But I've read some of your writings, and I'm sort of would like to draw you out a bit on how public opinion combines with jurisprudence and with efforts in international law to make this a more habitable Earth.
Well, I think, first of all, I think those of us who are committed to human rights and to a better world for all of us cannot give up. And the worst thing is when we become cynical about it, because cynicism really then becomes an excuse for doing nothing. We have to push. I must say, I never thought when I left Germany in '51 that it would be the Germany of today, that small town in Göttingen where my mother was born is a totally different place. The kids are different in the high school, very, very different. So we just have to believe and do what we need to do to fight for it. And train people. I mean, this is, I've spent part of my life really training young lawyers to work in this field, and that's very important.
You were the first chairman of the Committee on Conscience at the Holocaust Museum, a great institution that I'm proud to be associated with now, and I am curious what your prescription for the United States would be in terms of education or other matters to deepen the public commitment to human rights.
Well, I should tell you first, when I became chairman of the Committee on Conscience, there was a big struggle in the committee before you came, quite a long time before, between people who said we only need to talk about the Holocaust. This was, and some of us, I among them, felt that the Committee on Conscience of the Holocaust Museum had an obligation to those who died in the Holocaust to make sure that the world's human rights situation improves, that it's not a Jewish Holocaust issue. It's an issue that those of us who's lost people in the Holocaust would not be doing their job if we didn't actually use the Committee on Conscience and other institutions to promote human rights. I think there was a bigger struggle internally as in some of these organizations, but we won. And I think it's wonderful that the Holocaust Museum, which is in a sense a governmental institution, is continuing to promote human rights and sometimes do it even when the United States government is not assisting. I must say, without help of the United States and a few other countries, there's very little chance that the human rights situation in the world is going to improve. So we really have to work at it. And I don't think the current regime is going to stay in office very long. And we have so many good people in this country who can fill that job better. And so I have great faith. And I must say, if I didn't believe these things, it would destroy my whole life. So I think we can do it. And with just a little patience, which is sometimes difficult to have. And I must say, I'm very proud now of the Holocaust Museum, because more and more they're doing things. There's a program right now about Syria that they've been working on. And that's very important. It's a very big, it's an important example that it is the Holocaust Committee that is working on this subject today for the conditions that happen in the rest of the world.
So how do you feel when someone insists to you on the uniqueness of the Holocaust?
Well, it's unique to us who suffered, but it's not unique in the world in terms of the people who are dying. The killing is unique to them as well. I think the Holocaust is unique in the way it was organized and structured, but the killing, and that's not unique, unfortunately, in the world. I don't see what is gained by saying that the Holocaust was unique. I don't see it. I've never really understood what that meant, other than the mechanics. The Germans were better organized, great organizers, and many other countries killers are not, which is also good. But I don't see it's significant.
Well, as I said before, if you're optimistic, I don't think I have any right not to be. But I do have a question, and that is that, as you said in your remarks, that the Holocaust had a profound effect on human rights consciousness in the world, especially in the West, but really in many, many different places in the world. And as time passes, we're losing touch with that. And, for coming generations, it's going to be history. And I wonder if you feel that, conscious human effort can substitute for that direct connection and for that motive force that it gave.
Well, first of all, I think you will enjoy this, because when I'm introduced, often I'm introduced as one of the last Holocaust survivors, which makes me worry. When am I next?
I was trying to be more delicate.
No, you were very delicate.
Thank you.
Now I forgot the question you asked, of course.
Is it going to get harder for us without the living connection?
Yes. Yeah. I am not sure that that connection made that much difference in the rest of the world. I should tell you, when I came to the United States, as I mentioned, in 51, end of 51, for the next 2, 3, 4 years, nobody asked me about the camps. It was surprising. Among the Jewish community, nobody was interested. And I think part of it was also a bad conscience on the part of the Jewish community. It's quite clear, because a lot of people could have been helped before the war started, been brought to the United States, but visas couldn't be gotten from many in the Jewish community. And that is true for the efforts, for example, where I saw what my uncle tried to do to get my grandparents to the United States. You couldn't get visas from people because they didn't want to commit themselves. So that is a past, I think, that is important to recognize. But I think we human beings strive to be free, regardless of the obstacles. And if we as teachers can train enough young people to go out and push and invent new mechanisms and methods to fight violations of human rights, we'll make a lot of progress. There is progress in different parts. For example, I served on this Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Next month I'm going to Costa Rica, where the court sits, to celebrate its 40th anniversary. And the court has actually played an important role in strengthening the human rights situation in various Latin American countries. And that's exciting.
It's exciting, and the change in the hemisphere is really remarkable. Yeah. Not perfect, but really remarkable.
Right, and now, unfortunately, the pressure that some other of our presidents in the past brought on some government is not there.
Right. I remember reading something fascinating, that when the court was created, I guess people were being disappeared in Honduras. And the court just decided to issue an injunction that Honduras had to stop that, without having any confidence whatsoever that they would do anything of the sort.
We were surprised. It stopped. And as a matter of fact, these were the first disappearance cases that were decided in any international tribunal. And now we used to always side with the European court decisions. And now the Europeans, who have to deal with a lot of disappearances in certain parts of Europe, are citing our cases. So it's cooking.
Yeah.
And one has to have faith in it, because if not, what else is there? We just give up and let these things happen.
Can you tell us about your experience on the El Salvador Commission? Because in my researches, I got the sense that was a pivotal experience for you.
Yes. in 1991, a peace agreement was signed between the two warring parties in Salvador, and they decided to end the war, the government and the guerrillas fighting them, and decided to establish a truth commission to deal with the major crimes that were committed. And you probably all know the story of Archbishop Romero, who was killed in El Salvador. And so our job was to investigate and then report on what happened in El Salvador. What happened to me from time to time is that I would hear a story and do an investigation, and it would bring back memories of the past. And at one point we were in the building where 7 Jesuit priests had lived who were then killed, and we were taken in and shown, and our guide said that if you looked over this wall in the grass, you would have been able to see what was happening in this courtyard. And I had just been with my wife in Auschwitz, and I told her, just about when I was in Auschwitz, the grass didn't grow, no birds were flying, it was dead in a sense. And here in El Salvador, I'm reminded of it again, the grass, the roses. And when we then walked out of that building, there was a portrait of Archbishop Romero, and one of the soldiers had shot a hole into the Archbishop's portrait in the same place where he had been killed. This is in a Catholic country, Catholic soldiers. But you can't give up. We managed to get quite a number of them. We wrote up our report, and when our report came out, the government declared an amnesty for both parties. Now, you just say, this is the end. A few months ago, the Supreme Court of Salvador declared the amnesty unconstitutional. And the trials are beginning now. I could go into further detail, but this is, it shows you that you can't give up. You have to fight, and sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but you can't afford to lose.
So this is more by way of a footnote about you and your experience. Most of us in this room, I think, have seen an enormous number of movies about the Holocaust and read an enormous number of books and so on and so forth. You experienced it, but you can't actually read the books or watch the movies. Isn't that correct?
Well, the problem is that I can speak about it, my own experiences, and I've written a book about it, but I cannot read Holocaust books, I cannot read see movies about it or plays. And in one movie that we would take, my wife and I were told that this was a great movie, you have to see it. It was Life is Beautiful. And we walked in, and we didn't know what, and suddenly I saw the railroad cars. And we walked out immediately. So now my wife is the one who sees these movies first before we can.
Okay, last question, then we'll open it up to the audience. The thing that I think in your very, very long and distinguished CV that always stops my eye is your involvement with the Olympic Committee. Now,
I ran 100 meters and won.
What have you done with the Olympic Committee? Beyond the 100 meters.
Beyond that, it always impresses my students.
Yes.
They asked. Actually, I served for 10 years on the ethics committee of the International Olympic Committee. And as an award, I got an order. So I can't really call it a medal, but of course I call it a medal. Right. Especially used to tell it my students.
They didn't ask you to review the bidding process for the goods or anything like that.
But there's some terrible things happening in the Olympics, especially in countries with tickets and all of this. And that was our job to report on it and try to prevent it. And who would have ever thought that the kid from Auschwitz from the Death March would be sitting on the ethics committee of the Olympics? Right. So if I didn't have faith, who should?
So let's have some questions from the audience. There are mics circulating. Please do speak into the mic because we are taping this. And please just ensure that there's a question mark at the end of your question. I think we have someone. We have one here, one there. Whoever gets it first. Great.
Thank you so much for your inspiring speech. I want to ask about what you mentioned about the International Criminal Court, because there were so much hope when the court was established that it's going to play the central role of being the guardian of the international humanitarian norms and standards, and there is finally an enforcement mechanism. Do you think that this can be still considered a rational thing, or is the role of the ICC over?
Can you repeat the final sentence?
Do you think that the centrality of the International Criminal Court to the international humanitarian system is still something valid, or do you think that the failures of the past years of the court to enforce its mandate would make the international system in need of a new body?
Well, you have to remember the court is brand new. It really hasn't. It has only less than a few years to develop. So to say that its failure, it hasn't been able to fail. It hasn't had too many cases, unfortunately. And one of the sad things is that the United States is not a party to the treaty establishing the court. But even in the absence, there are a lot of countries there. And I think the court is going to, in the long run, it will take time, perform a useful service.
Okay. We have someone right here.
Hi. As some of us are parents, and it looks like some people are grandparents here, I was curious, and grandchildren, as to when you were reunited with your mother. Can you describe that for us? And also, can you describe your mother and maybe some lessons and how she was a person in your life?
You know, I will have to apologize to you because I always break down when I describe the reunion with my mother. It took me about 4 or 5 times to get started when I was writing the book to describe it. You'll have to read the book. But she was an unbelievable person. You probably all heard of Dr. Mengele from Auschwitz. She was walking down. The usual rule was you walk down past him and he sends you this way or that way. This way was to the chamber, to the gas chambers. And he looked at her, and my mother had the thyroid condition which showed. So he looked at her and said, thyroid in German, Basador. And she looked at him, and in her perfect German, of course, said, "You're a magnificent diagnostician, doctor." And he let her. That was my mother. Another example was when we were still in Slovakia, and they took away, still the Slovaks had taken away the hotel my father bought after he left Germany. My father left one day, and the Czechs decided to deport all foreign Jews. And they came to our little apartment where we were living. My mother and I were alone. And they just pulled us out, brought us to this group where already hundreds of people were waiting to be deported. And my mother, again, in her German, North German, said, "Where's the commandant here? I want to speak to the commandant. We are German citizens, and look what you're doing to, I want to speak to the German consul." And then she's got the commandant, and she showed him her passport, and he allowed us to go. It was her driver's license. So that was my mother. She was unbelievable, and she was about 5'1", 5'2" tall. She never gave up looking for me when everybody said I could not possibly have survived it. And she just insisted. And there was unbelievable correspondence that I found at Arolsen, which is the depository of many of the Holocaust documents, and also post-war documents that show what happened in different camps, almost individual chronicles of what happened there. And she just, the letters she wrote and the letters she got back to and insisted, 2 years, and many people would have given up, and she insisted I was alive. She saw a picture of an English soldier with a child that she insisted was me. It wasn't, but she believed it. She wanted to believe it, and she used that picture. So that was my mother.
What was her name?
Yada. Yeah, no, she, well, we all think like this about our mothers, but she was tested.
There were some hands up over here. Looked student-like. Great.
Yeah, hi, hello. So I'm a government student here at Dartmouth, and yesterday we discussed how the Polish government has just passed this new law in which it is illegal to state that there was collaboration between the Polish government and Nazi Germany, punishable by up to 3 years. And I wanted to know, what is your opinion in such matter, especially in an international system in which we're struggling to protect such history in order to advance in these human rights?
Well, I should tell you that what's happening, my wife and I were in Poland about half a year ago, just before this new government came to power, and I was a guest of the Polish Ombudsman for Human Rights in Poland. And he was very optimistic, and it was a new Poland, because there had been a lot of anti-Semitism in Poland, tremendous anti-Semitism before the war. And as a matter of fact, many people thought initially that if there was going to be a Holocaust, it was in Poland rather than Germany. It was, I must say, I had been helped by Poles throughout. This development in Poland now is terribly, it's something that is a great disappointment. On the other hand, I see movement in the European Union to put pressure on Poland, and I think the European Union can do that because Poland needs the economic assistance and other assistance that the European Union gives. And I think if any other group of countries can have any impact on Poland, the European Union will. And one of those countries that are working on this is Germany these days. So, but it's terrible that this walking back, because for a while it really looked like a new Poland, everything about it. And then suddenly this government comes in and just brings everything back. So you have to live in a world where that has to happen, and we just have to figure out some ways to fight against it again.
I had a question about how can countries move on with their history? Like I think
I'm sorry, I can't.
How can countries move on from their bloody history? Like you cited Germany, but how can, like, because I personally feel every country has some blood on their hands, and that's just leaders as well as citizens. Like how can we help shape our national conscience away and so recognize the past and move on with it?
I'm not sure.
Question is, how do countries that have blood on their hands, as all do, move on and integrate these concerns into their politics.
Well, oftentimes they have no other solution if they want to be successful in the international community. Countries nowadays, many countries are not just single-standing countries. They depend on a lot of other international things, on the economy, on trade, on assistance in other forms. And if there are enough countries to tie their assistance to an improvement of the political situation, we often see success. But it's a slow process. But the European Union now has tremendous influence.
Just to underscore that, I think one thing that Americans probably are not always aware of is just what a big force for strengthening human rights the EU has become. We're a little solipsistic in thinking that we're the only player in the sandbox, but the EU has really become an extraordinary force for good in that regard.
Very much so, very much so. And I hope that the U.S. will, one of these days, again show the same enthusiasm, support as it did in the past. And I'm sure it will happen. But it's true. Single country, some people in one country often cannot do it alone. They need the support from the outside. And in the Polish situation or others, it's the existence of the European Union and their ideas about what democracy should be make a big difference.
Sir, was the International Court behind the reconciliation between the Hutus and Tutsis in that situation?
In Rwanda.
In Rwanda. I really don't know. I mean, what is happening in Rwanda, of course, is a genocide. And this is something that one has to fight against. And Rwanda is beginning to change a little bit under pressure. And the pressure has to be increased. Rwanda is a country that really cannot exist by itself and have those policies. So great pressure has to be brought. Again, the United States is totally silent in this situation. But what is happening now is that India, of course, is there and some other countries, and they are receiving some of these refugees who are fleeing, and they are bringing some pressure, and also getting some international organizations to bring pressure. So it helps. But terrible, this was really a genocide, which incidentally, and this is something that we tend not to realize, there is a UN High Commissioner for Refugees, a Jordanian, who's been doing, there have been some others, but he's by far the best we've ever had. And he was the one who called what was happening in Rwanda a genocide. And has been pushing. Unfortunately, he's leaving now, and you never know who one is going to get next. But he's been a tremendous force for the good.
Hi. Can you say in general what you think about the use of the practice of granting amnesty to people who've committed horrific crimes against humanity? Is it always a bad thing, always a good thing, or does it depend on the circumstances?
Yes. No, some international courts have held that amnesty is illegal. I think under certain circumstances I would not reach that conclusion. I think it depends on the situation, but I certainly wouldn't grant amnesty across the board in countries where you have had massive violations of human rights. People have to be, you have to try people, you have to show that these acts cannot be permitted in the world in which we live. And amnesties destroy all of that, of course. So I think one should necessarily write off the possibility of amnesty. But one has to be very careful about granting them, so that people don't just expect it, that it'll come and you can do anything you want to, and then you'll get an amnesty and you will have profited from all the terrible, destructive work they have committed. So it's not something I favor, but I at the same time don't favor the idea that it never should be denied.
Do you have a view would you rate how well the international community did through the tribunals for Yugoslavia and for Rwanda?
I know very little in detail about Rwanda. I know much more about the Yugoslav tribunal because it was right in The Hague where we also were, and many of my friends were on that tribunal. I think they have done a very good job. And they've received surprising cooperation from various countries. And what they've done is really, for those of us who are teaching in this field, they've provided us with a tremendous amount of case law that now will be used and usable by the International Criminal Court, because they've worked for a long period of time and decided some very important cases and ordered the incarceration of quite a lot of people who were guilty of very terrible crimes in all of the countries of the former Yugoslavia. Mm-hmm. The Serbs were, of course, the Serbs complain that they have been the ones who've been hit the hardest, in a sense, maybe because they committed many of those crimes.
I'm sorry. Yeah, great.
I have the microphone, apparently. So since World War II, kind of the role of governments has been added on to the role of corporations in human rights abuses. Can you not hear me?
Start again?
Yeah, sorry. So since World War II, kind of the role of corporations in human rights abuses has increased, and a lot of domestic international law has struggled for that. I know the Supreme Court tried to deal with it for a while by using pirate law and applying them to corporations like Chevron in Nigeria. And in our current context, we have problems with Facebook setting up internet systems in foreign countries and then not regulating them. So the UN has declared kind of a lot of the killing occurring in places like Myanmar being fueled by Facebook. And so, you know, in the context of other case examples, like in Rwanda, where we didn't jam the radios, in our modern system where we have these new forms of connection and integration through technology and corporations that also allow for great violence, what do you kind of think we should do in that situation? How should governments leverage their power against things like Facebook, or regulate them, or even do criminal complicity charges in that complexity?
You seem to know much more about it than I do. Obviously, I think, notwithstanding what the Supreme Court has said, I do believe that corporations should be held liable for violations of human rights. I don't see any problem with that. I mean, it raises some legal issues, but my own feel is that you can hold corporations liable and should. But that's about all I can say about it, because I don't see why governments cannot regulate the conduct, the behavior of corporations in different countries. The corporations are subject to the rules of law established by the countries in which they operate. And it's the responsibility of those countries. And if they don't do the job they should do, then there are international tribunals to deal with it. So the reason I said you seem to know more about it than I, because I've never seen the seriousness of this problem, because I see that it's the obligation of states to control, and if necessary, dissolve them, punish them where it hurts, which is usually with tremendous fines. I realize that we have problems now that most of us don't really understand, and I am one of those. But these are problems that are going to get more serious in the future, and therefore states have to be held responsible for what happens by corporations that are incorporated in their countries. I'm sorry I interrupted. Yeah,
Don't apologize to me. That was great.
So the United States has ratified only 3 of the 9 UN human rights treaties. And if you were, like, say, an activist in the United States, and you were, like, say, a child's rights activist, and you had limited time, would you advocate focusing on just working on children's rights? And how much of your energy would you put into trying to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child or any of the other human rights treaties? Is it worth the struggle that it would take in order to get the United States to ratify the remaining human rights treaties?
You know, I've never thought of the issue. To me, what is much more important that certain other countries ratify these conventions than necessarily the United States, because of the energies that it would take. I've always thought that, and I've testified before the Congress on most of these conventions, that the U.S. should ratify them, because if nothing else, the presence of the U.S. in those committees that are established by these conventions helps in strengthening these committees. And the U.S. ratification experience has not been very great, as you point out. I don't know whether it's only 3. I think, is it only 3? I served on the Covenant Committee as a U.S. member, elected on the nomination of the United States, and which is one of the major ones, and so is the racial one. But with children and the Women's Convention as well, I think it's more important to put some efforts into getting certain other countries to ratify these conventions, who have more serious problems with those issues that the convention deal with than the United States. Which doesn't mean that I justify U.S. staying out. But if we only have limited resources, limited power, what do we focus on? I'd rather have some countries where you have children working in the streets, terrible conditions. That, to me, would justify encouraging the ratification of those countries where these children are, where it could help.
I'm curious. One of the areas where I think human rights law is really facing challenging debates now has to do with hate speech. And you obviously were born in a country that has a very strong position against hate speech right now. Well, you weren't born in one. You went to high school in one, and you were the victim of one. But you have worked your entire career in the U.S. system where, you're surrounded by First Amendment absolutists, and I'd be curious about your position on this.
Yes. It's an issue that comes up often in classes. It used to. I always feel that in the United States, trying to make hate speech illegal is not really necessary. Whereas in some other countries it is necessary. And the reason for it is that in some other countries, if something is not prohibited, you can engage in it. In the US, we have so many other social pressures that prevent a lot of hate speech from gaining hold, that I think the price we would pay for restraining the freedom of expression, it's not worth it. You have to choose. And I think, for example, in Germany or in France, you have to prohibit it. Because then they would say, well, it's obviously allowed, and then we can do what we want to do. The social pressures in the US are such that it's very difficult to. I've often thought if I, as a professor, would start exercising my freedom of speech, sprouting off a lot of hate, what would happen to me as a professor? They wouldn't have to try me. professionally I would be dead. So it's these social pressures in the United States that play a very significant role. But in other countries, I think it is quite important to have it.
Take a global position on this.
No.
Yeah.
But I should tell you, when I was on the UN Human Rights Committee, we got a very interesting case from a Holocaust denier from France who had been convicted in France. And he came to and his position was basically that Auschwitz was really not an extermination camp, but just a working camp, people, and similar things. And he came to the committee and wanted us to do something about his conviction in France. And I decided I had to recuse myself from this case. But I recused myself with the following statement that said, in view of the fact that my father died in a concentration camp, that my grandparents died in a concentration camp, that my mother survived and lived in a concentration, I cannot in good faith take part in this proceeding, which was really true, but I thought it was important to say why I would not participate in the case. The committee, incidentally, decided to reject this case, but I was not involved in any of it.
Final question. Oh, now the hands go up again. Okay, here and then here. Okay.
Hello, thank you for being here. Back to Sachsenhausen.
I'm sorry?
Back to Sachsenhausen,
Yeah.
when you were there. Did you ever hear of stories of anyone escaping from there?
Of Sachsenhausen? No, but remember, I was there basically in the infirmary until liberation, very short period of time. I haven't. And there were rumors that people had escaped from Auschwitz. What I should tell you about this, again, is sort of history of camps. When we were in the ghetto and some people came back and said, this is what's happening in Auschwitz and in other camps, we all said that can't be. They're exaggerating. This is sort of our... And when our train came into Auschwitz and drove in, we looked up and people said, oh, they're human beings there, so they're not killing everybody. That's sort of the human attitude when you face that kind of experience.
You've mentioned some cases where the United States ignores human rights violations that happen in some parts of the world, but I'm wondering how you think
Did I say that? Did you hear me say cases?
I'm wondering how you think that the human rights community should respond or can respond to situations in which the United States actually causes those violations, like in Yemen right now, where a lot of the kind of troops that are committing these crimes are sponsored by Americans, because to me it seems like with the United Nations, where the United States has a veto power on the Security Council, there can't really be that much progress.
I'm not sure.
The question is, what can the human rights community do when the United States is party to some of these human rights abuses?
What can the United States do, or can
What can the human rights community do when the U.S. is implicated?
Publicize it, write about it, talk about it, get members of Congress and others to speak about it and try to prevent it, of course.
And actually, I mean, this is happening now. It is
Yes.
way too slowly, way too late. Congress is voicing its disgust with what's going on in Yemen. I don't know if it'll be enough, but there is a movement afoot. So, okay. Any final questions? Yes, Professor Brooks.
I'm sorry I didn't bring my children here today. I think this would have been wonderful for them to hear. And so I was wondering what you would say to a child of roughly the age you were speaking of earlier today, say 10 years old, who's growing up today, maybe here in the US. What would you recommend to them as to how to move forward in their lives and think about the world in the context of the things you've seen?
my wife is here and we smile at each other, because I should tell you, one of the hardest things I've had in my own family, whenever I tried to tell my children what happened in the camps, they were not interested. At least I thought they weren't interested. And my wife always kept saying, they don't want to hear it because they don't want to hear the suffering of the parent. And I think I've gradually worked myself to that position. And the other day, one of my sons, who is now in the 50s, said the same thing. It's a mea culpa in terms of attitude. I think we used to, at our table, for example, always speak about what was going on in certain countries, how terrible it was, and what should be done about it, and who could possibly do something. How could you in schools say something about it? So my own thing was of no interest to the kids, but things happening in the world, we could always talk about it and encourage them even to ask in class and try to get some movement going in schools. I think you have to do it because to have the holidays we often, all of us celebrate, are so far in the past that they are they're not real. Yet what's happening around the world is real and is real to the children, and they have to be taught that these are terrible things that must be stopped, and that these human beings who are suffering are the same human beings that we are. I think that is an important point as well.
That's a great place to stop, and I would just add that maybe not a 10-year-old, but a 13-year-old or a 12-year-old would benefit tremendously from reading Tom's memoir, A Lucky Child, which is really an extraordinary book, and I can't recommend it highly enough. And the Dickey Center is happy to help you find copies. Let's put it that way.
Thank you.
Right. Anyway, I hope you'll join me in thanking Tom Buergenthal for a remarkable afternoon.